Here we go. Okay, so welcome everyone to tonight's discussion on conservation, burial, and green cemeteries. And we're really delighted that so many people have been interested. We had over 70 people register for this. So the interest runs deep, and I think that's fantastic. And we're lucky to have such a wonderful group of people willing to share their expertise. I want to thank the Strong Hancock Funeral Home. They sponsored this, and Dusty Hancock was going to be one of the presenters, but he was called away on a family emergency, so he's not able to be here. But they were wonderful supporters of this right from the get-go. This has been a year and a half in the planning, like a lot of things. It went awry last April, but we're really glad to be able to offer it this way. And I just want to say a little bit about Midcoast Conservancy for anybody who doesn't know about it. We're based in Edgecombe, but our service area goes from Westport Island up to Liberty and Freedom. And we've got the Sheepskin River watershed, the Madomic River watershed, and the Damerscott Lake watershed all in our care. And we've got over 13,000 acres and 55 preserves and almost 100 miles of trails. And we were doing all kinds of wonderful programming, as I was saying a little bit earlier. And if you're not a member, I highly recommend joining us, and that keeps you in the loop about all the kinds of things that we're doing. But at any rate, I'd love to get on with the program now. We're going to let each presenter introduce themselves rather than me leaping in between people. And so we're going to kick it off with Allison Rector.
Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Allison Rector, and I'm going to speak first, and I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you so you can see some pictures. And my goal is to sort of do an overview and get you familiar with some definitions of the terms that we're using, because first of all, Allie, thank you so much. And thank you to the Midcoast Conservancy. You guys have really stuck with this program. And I'm so excited to hear the other speakers tonight, because we kind of are a community who all know each other. And this is really great to come together and celebrate the good things that are going on in Maine around green burial. So yeah, as I said, my name is Allison Rector. My husband and I have lived in Monroe, Maine, which is in the greater sort of Belfast area since 1990. And I'm here as a consumer advocate from the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Maine. I've served on their board and also on the National Funeral Consumers Alliance. And those are nonprofit organizations in Maine. We're staffed by volunteers, and we advocate for public rights around funerals, the cost of funerals, your rights as consumers to get information that you need. And we don't advocate any one choice. We just help people get the information about what funerals cost and how to get the funeral you want, and in a way that fits your budget and your family's sort of personal tastes and needs. I got involved with Funeral Consumers Alliance about 10 years ago when my parents died, and Chuck Lakin, who was one of our speakers tonight, helped me out. So I'm just passing along the help that I got and hoping that this helps all of us get the deaths and funerals that we want. And I'm not a funeral director. I'm here to advocate for all of us and what we want. And green funerals, green burial that we're talking about tonight is just one choice of many. And no matter what you choose as a consumer for your family or yourself is the right choice. So this is just one of many possibilities. And it's something obviously that the presenters who are presenting tonight feel is a good option, and the Conservancy community too. Okay, I'm going to try to go ahead and share my screen, which worked a minute ago. Okay, and I'm going to share some images with you. So let's see. Okay, and can you see my screen? Yes, I'm seeing, okay. So this is my introduction. I am Allison from the Funeral Consumers Alliance. This is a natural burial site, actually not in Maine, in Tennessee, but I just thought it was a lovely image of, the kind of open area that most green burial sites are. So what is green burial? This is a picture that I took in England. I've visited a lot of green burial sites in Maine and around the country, and also in the United Kingdom, where they are embracing green burial, natural burial, and woodland burials. But green burial is a burial practice that emphasizes simplicity and environmental sustainability. And when I talk about green burial, or any of us talk about green burial tonight, what we're really talking about is burying a whole body burial. We may have questions later about, if I choose cremation, can I have cremated remains put into a green cemetery? And that may or may not be true depending on the cemetery. But the overarching principle is that it's something that's simple, that encourages decomposition, that takes care of the land, and is a practice that our ancestors used. And it's your choice of what you do with your body after you die can be an environmental decision. And I know for many of us, that's a concern. We've been composting our whole lives. Why would we not keep that in mind when we get to thinking about our deaths? So here are some of the essential elements of natural or green burial. And the term green, we know that can be a confusing term, and I'm going to go into a little more depth about what green actually means and how we define it with terms. But this is the overview here. As I said a minute ago, when we talk about the natural or green burial of a body, we're talking about whole body burial and no embalming. So no chemicals to preserve the body. It's just the body as it is. And everything that goes into that grave is biodegradable. So the materials, there's no liner lining the surrounding hole where the body is put. The ingredients that go into it, whether it's a burial shroud or a wooden casket, the goal is that all of that is biodegradable, and decomposition is encouraged rather than with conventional cemeteries. The idea is that you'll be preserved intact forever. With natural burial, we think of it as going back to the earth, and that's a good thing. So we're encouraging that process. Looking for minimal environmental impact. So rather than the perfectly mowed lawn of a conventional cemetery, or invasive plants being planted, or the landscape being disturbed, we're trying to keep that impact minimal. And this is not a new idea, as any of us know who have had ancestors who buried in this way. In the old days, you would have grandmother in the front parlor and the family would be involved. And then, you might use a family plot, which is legal to do here in Maine if you jump through some hurdles. So this is actually just a way of going back to a previous practice, or a way that a lot of the world still does it. And some additional characteristics of green burial may be, and this can vary from cemetery to cemetery, and we have cemeterians here among our presenters who can tell us how they do it. You may want to mark the gravesite, and you may be allowed to do that with a flat or local stone or a natural marker, or other, sometimes a plant. Opening the grave, which is digging the hole where the body is put, or closing it, putting the dirt back on, may be done by hand, although sometimes other equipment is involved. With green burial or natural burial, you bury about 3 or 4 feet deep. So the old words that we heard, 6 feet deep, that's actually deeper than what green burial is going to be using. And the reason for that, and I know some of our other speakers are expert in this, is we want aerobic decomposition to happen. So if you go too deep, you're going to actually prevent that process. And so 3 or 4 feet is the ideal depth. And it may need to be backfilled as time goes on, if that area is as the earth settles. And this data that I have came from Green Burial, Massachusetts, and they say that with green cemeteries, usually it's about 100 to 200 burial sites per 1,000 versus 1,000 per acre for conventional burial. So that's just a guideline, but it might be actually fewer bodies per acre than other cemeteries use. All right, here's a kind of photographic depiction. This also came from Green Burial, Massachusetts, our friends down there. But on the left, you see a photograph of this preparation of a site in a conventional cemetery. On the right, you see Steelmantown Cemetery in Steelmantown, New Jersey. And you can see that the conventional burial practice is there's some equipment there that is the metal box that actually lowers the coffin in. So it's a lowering, like an elevator apparatus to lower the coffin in. And you can see there's a green tarp around the grass to make it look all perfect. And the coffin in the distance seems to have sort of a metal lid. It's, an elaborate metal and wood coffin. And you can see on the other image, a nice pile of dirt that's been taken out of the ground, some boards around the hole, which just, Joyce, you can explain this to us more later, but it's supporting those edges while the coffin, with some boards going across, which will help support the body before it's lowered into the hole, and a natural setting with trees and grasses. This slide comes from the Green Burial Council, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the environmental impact of the funeral industry as it is now. If you use a grave liner in a conventional cemetery and a fancy coffin with metal and wood, we use, and embalming fluid, you can see the data here on, the thousands of trees and concrete and millions of gallons of embalming fluid that does contain formaldehyde that go into our burial practices. In Maine, we have a high rate of cremation. I think about 70% of Mainers choose cremation when they die. And that doesn't involve, although some people are embalmed before they're cremated, but that choice can involve the use of fossil fuels for flame cremation. So I know those of you tuning in, that's part of your concern probably, is avoiding this environmental impact. This chart came from a green cemetery that I visited in Minnesota, and I thought it was kind of neat. It shows kind of a cross section of the soil, comparing on the left how the soil is cut into with standard burial, and on the right the natural. And you can see the graphics are a little bit small, but it shows the conventional burial being about 5 feet deep with a grave liner, which is usually, it's a concrete box that's required by the cemetery in the soil to support the soil, to keep it flat for mowing the lawn later. And there's a traditional headstone on that. And by comparison, on the right, the cross section of a natural site shows a 3.5 foot deep hole. It shows either a card in the picture. It looks like either a cardboard or bamboo, biodegradable coffin with some flowers inside, and some more native natural plants at the top, and maybe a small marker. So, all right, why do we choose green burial? And these are the reasons. This came from the Green Burial Council, which is a national organization that certifies green cemeteries around the country, and funeral providers, and also materials that are sold, products that go, like coffins. But they did a survey of 70 green burial cemeteries in 2015, and these are the reasons why people like us are choosing green burial. The largest one was minimizing the impact on the environment. So that's related to that earlier slide that I showed you. Going back to old traditions, so looking at the way Mainers in the past did it, and returning to that tradition. The third most popular reason is cost. We know that, I think nationally, the cost of a funeral, if you have a conventional burial and use a funeral home, is somewhere $7,000 to $10,000, and usually a green cemetery will be less, not necessarily, but it also, green burial, depending on your family, may also involve the family doing some of the tasks, choosing to do some of the tasks themselves, like building a coffin or being involved in the closing of the grave. So there are choices you can make as consumers that can reduce the cost and possibly the cost of the green burial site. So that's a third reason. Spiritual or religious reasons. And we're going to hear from Jean Berman at the end of our talk about the Jewish tradition. As I wrote here, some religious traditions incorporate green burial practices and have, so we can look to them for models about how we can do this. And the last most popular reason was sort of a do-it-yourself ethic, which we as Mainers have. How many green cemeteries are in the USA? When I looked up the data today, it said about 333. And you can see, if you look from on the left, starting in 2015, April of 2015, to on the right, April of 2020, there has been growth both. Let's see, the blue is US and Canada together, the green is Canada, and the red is New England. So all of those have grown. And of the 333 cemeteries around the United States today, there are kind of three categories. We use the term green. I'm going to explain this a little bit more, but 261 of those 333 are hybrid cemeteries, 56 are natural cemeteries, and 16 are conservation cemeteries. So I will explain a little more about each of what those mean, as will our other presenters. All right, we currently have 5 green cemeteries in Maine, about 5. And I think I've visited 4 of them. And on the left, you see a picture of, on the right, of Rainbow's End, which is a natural cemetery in Orrington, Maine. And there's a small marker on the lower part of the image that says Friedman, and the people who were buried at this site chose, instead of putting their birth dates and death dates, it was a couple, and they put their anniversary date on the stone, which I thought was lovely, and you can see the wooded setting. And on the left is Joyce Foley, who's one of our presenters, doing her work at Cedar Brook Burial Ground in Leamington, and she's in front of a stone that says Pearson in the woods. Okay, let's go a little deeper into the word green, because we know that that can be a little fuzzy when we go to buy organic produce. What is green, or products at the grocery store? These definitions come from the Green Burial Council, which has a terrific website if you want to learn a little more. So I told you there were those three terms: hybrid cemetery, natural cemetery, and conservation cemetery. And we have some of each here in Maine. A hybrid cemetery is an area within a conventional cemetery. So it may be that your municipality or a local church has a I know I live near the city of Belfast. There are, I think, 9 or 10 cemeteries in Belfast. And if they chose to make a section of their cemetery green or a natural burial area and keep the rest of it a conventional cemetery, that would be a hybrid. It would have some of both. And in the green area, there would, it would comply with those things that I explained earlier: no concrete vault in that part of the cemetery, no embalming, and using a biodegradable container. So they could do both conventional burial, where those things are allowed, but in the green section, those would have to comply with the green standards. And in Maine, we have 2 hybrid cemeteries that I know of. One is Burr Cemetery, which is in Freeport. And I was chatting with my colleagues just before you all joined in. The 2 veterans cemeteries in Maine, the Southern Maine Veterans Cemetery and the Augusta Maine Veterans Cemetery, are in the process of including a green section, or it may actually be available now. I think Chuck knows a little bit more because he's actually been to visit it. So Chuck Lakin can tell us more. A natural cemetery is where all of those requirements are employed, and the cemetery is dedicated to natural burial, such as Joyce and Cedar Brook Burial Ground in Leamington, Maine, and Rainbow's End Cemetery in Orrington. So they do natural burial, and you have to, anybody that's buried there complies with those, must use biodegradable containers and no vault and no chemical embalming. And Joyce will tell us more about that. And the third definition is a conservation cemetery, where a land trust entity preserves land, and part of that is used for burial. And in Maine, we are so excited to be hearing about the brand new opening of Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery in Fayette. And the next presenter, Susan, will be telling us about that. So, at the bottom I wrote here, ask your municipality if they'd go green. In my work as a green burial enthusiast, I've been trying to approach my local town and ask them, hey, would you consider making a small corner of our cemetery green? Haven't had success with that yet, but I'm going to keep plugging on it. So, all right, here is Joyce at the Cedar Brook Burial Ground in Leamington. And she was, the day I visited, I think the funeral director was there. The family wasn't there yet, but she had opened an area of the cemetery, and you can see the soil that came out of the ground and the planks supporting where the coffin would be lowered into or the body would be lowered into the ground later. And this picture I downloaded from the Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery website today, showing their new site. And as I said, choosing burial at a conservation cemetery helps support land and conservation efforts. And for some people, the choice of caring for a loved one can be part of the healing process. This doesn't have to be part of green burial. You don't have to participate, but if you choose to, it can be a way for the body to, or the family or friends to help prepare a body. That's a home funeral. Build a coffin. In this case, the family used a shroud around this body. This is a shot from above looking down at a body that's been lowered into the ground. And the cotton shroud that was around, linen shroud that was around this family's loved one had messages written on it and drawings, and they tucked notes and things in with the body as it was lowered and put flowers on it. And I have a Maine example of how a family was involved with a burial at Rainbow's End in Orrington. So in January of 2017, I was lucky enough to be part of a memorial at Rainbow's End for a friend. And I have 4 pictures of that family gathering. It was January, but it was a warm January, and they were able to open the ground at Rainbow's End, even though it was January, with not too much trouble, meaning they could dig the hole without, the ground wasn't fully frozen. It was a little bit of a drizzly day in January, and you can see the friends and family walking in and down the path to the site, and in the small figures in the distance are 2 family members who are pulling the hand-built casket that was built by this person's husband and pulled into the site on a toboggan. And when we arrived at the site, the hole had already been dug. You can see a blue tarp on the left where the dirt was being saved to put back on top. And here, friends and family members are lowering this hand-built coffin into the ground with ropes. And the lid of the coffin had some beautiful comments and words and messages on top of it. And there's the toboggan in the front. People spoke and shared memories and put flowers into the grave. And then later, before everyone left, the friends and family closed the grave, which is used a shovel to put the soil back on top of the coffin and enclose it in the earth themselves. And here's a picture of that cemetery, Rainbow's End, in the spring when there isn't snow, and that funeral that we just saw happened at the edge of the woods in the far distance there. That person is buried back on the edge of the woods and the meadow. So that's it for my slideshow. And what if your last gift act could be a gift? Thank you all for listening and for considering this. And I think I've got just enough time on the clock here, which I was hoping, to show you a short video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes. It reiterates much of what I said, but I think in a really good way. And let me see if I can, let me see, how do I do this? First, I'm going to exit the slideshow. And let's see. Okay, and see if I can show you. This is from the PBS NewsHour, and they had a short segment about green burial. Can you see my screen here? Like, Jean, could you give me, okay, Jean, give me a thumbs up. And let me see, all right.
Friendly ways, buying vehicles with better gas mileage and products made closer to home, using less carbon-intensive forms of energy like wind and solar. What people consider less is the impact their bodies have on the world after they die, how that can be more environmentally sound. There's a growing movement in this country focused on just that, and it's the subject of a new documentary called Dying Green. Directed by Ellen Tripler, the short film follows a pioneer of the green burial movement, Dr. Billy Campbell, who in 1998 created the first green cemetery in South Carolina.
The first thing was about 7th or 8th grade, where I had the teacher who said he was going to be buried in a burlap bag and have a tree plant over him. And this was the first Earth Day. That was about the time. And I was in middle school. I just thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. So I would always tell people, when I die, I'm going to be put in a burlap bag and have a tree planted over me, because Mr. Cruz had said that. I just thought that was a cool thing. In college, I was reading a lot of death studies, the American Way of Death. I had a girlfriend at the time who suggested some things I could read. And she had taken the death studies course at the university. And at some point, that idea of having a natural burial area came into fuzzy focus, that maybe you could save land. And then at some point, probably before my dad died, I heard about the prairie cemeteries that they were trying to protect because they protected tallgrass prairie and the Midwest. And I said, well, if that can happen by accident, why couldn't we do something by design? I could see how it could be a powerful tool, and I would talk about it, but then when my dad died and we spent enough money to buy 5 to 10 acres of land at the time on that funeral, I decided I had to do something. And then it only took me another 11 years to actually form the company with a couple other guys who helped out. My dad's death was the thing that made it real. It wasn't just this fun thing to talk about.
Dr. Campbell and Ellen Tripler join us now. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So, Ellen, first kind of set the stage for us. As you made this film, what is a green burial?
Well, a green burial is a burial that has the least impact on the environment. There's no embalming fluid used. There's a shroud used. Sometimes it's a simple casket. There's no cement, steel, or hardwoods used. There are no pesticides used to keep up the grounds around the cemetery.
You point out in the film that how we are preserved today isn't necessarily the prettiest, the cleanest.
Now, people have a false idea they're going to be like Vladimir Lenin in this glass box and are Snow White and never change, and that's just not true. The embalming is done to keep the body fresh for the service. And there are other ways of doing that with just to keep the body cool with ice. You can pretty much do the same thing. Most funeral homes these days have coolers. But it's just to keep the body looking more natural at room temperature for a little bit longer. But it's not nearly enough to do long-term preservation. When I was in medical school with cadavers, they have to use a lot of preservative for that to last long enough for us to have our dissections over a period of weeks or months. And that doesn't look nice either. It doesn't look natural.
And you also make the point in the movie that of a kind of a different relationship that people have with nature. I mean, what your father, you had to bury your father, and where he is now versus what some of your, I guess, clients are.
Yeah, my father is buried in a very scenic place in a little country churchyard, but it's a churchyard, and it has pea gravel and a fence, and that's not a bad choice. It's a different choice than I would make for myself. And so we're not saying these are bad choices, but this idea of a more natural burial is actually what my great-grandparents would have done. Position this in a way.
America has a very proud and noble tradition of taking care of its own dead. People used to do that, especially in rural communities where we are. It was almost by necessity. When somebody died, they laid the body out in the front parlor. The women washed the body, the men dug the grave and made the casket, and they took care of it themselves. But as we have changed, as more people work now, part of the ritual that has developed has in a lot of ways created a disconnect with death.
The difference with what we're trying to do is not just the burial process, but then the bigger picture of saving land. That when you die, it's not just that you're doing a green burial, which you could do in a contemporary cemetery, really, but that you're also helping to create a functioning nature preserve. Ecological restoration, which is what we're trying to do at Ramsey Creek upstream, it may take several hundred years. And that's way beyond any of our lifespans. So how do you fund that, number one? And then how do you sustain it? You have to build a community, and this is part of building the links between human communities and natural communities that are long-term transgenerational.
So by people doing this in your community, they're essentially helping sustain that particular preserve.
Yes.
All right. The name of the documentary is Dying Green. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that film. And I'm now going to pass this on to, thank you, Jean, to my colleague, Susan Caldwell, who is here from the Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was great. I learned a lot just then. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to also take a second to transition and share my screen and make sure that is working well. Can I get a thumbs up if that looks like it's working? And I want to start by thanking Midcoast Conservancy very much for putting this together and for patiently waiting for it to come together. And I will say that I am definitely not an expert on conservation and green burials. I am a very enthusiastic learner and have an opportunity to work closely with the Kennebec Land Trust on this endeavor that's happening right now. So I'm really excited to share just kind of a story of how that Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery is coming together. So as introduction, I my day job is with the Nature Conservancy in Maine as a conservation manager. I'm a very enthusiastic Midcoast Conservancy member and Hidden Valley appreciator. Thank you so much, Midcoast Conservancy. And I'm also a volunteer steward for the Kennebec Land Trust for a property. I've been a board member there for about 3 years and have recently become a member of the Conservation Burial Ground Board as well. So we're really excited to be able to announce that as of July 1st, 2021, the Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery is going to be fully operational. And it's been a long and winding and wonderful road to get to this point. And I just want to tell you a little bit of the story of that winding road. I will also make sure when I'm done talking, I'll put the website in the chat so that you can check it out yourselves more. And it's just baldwinhillcemetery.org, but I'll put that in the chat later. And the website probably can answer almost all your questions, and I'll try to do my best at the end tonight if you have other questions. And if I can't answer them, I can certainly get back to you, but the website has been a remarkable thing. So just in general, the Baldwin Hill Cemetery seeks to provide ecologically sound burial for people of all faiths and to serve as a model of green burial practices in Maine and beyond. It was just incorporated as a 501c13 in 2020, and there is now a 6-member board supporting the Kennebec Land Trust staff to manage the operations. So I will really quickly breeze over this because we just got a great education about natural and green cemeteries, but just to stress that we're thinking mostly about the minimal environmental impact, conservation of natural resources, reduction of carbon emissions, and restoration and preservation of habitat. The difference, as we learned a little bit about between a conservation cemetery and a natural cemetery, includes these items. So a conservation cemetery is established in partnership with a conservation organization. So the management is done in a way that uses best conservation practices. There is a perpetual protection of the land, conservation of at least 20 acres or 5 acres if it's contiguous to other protected lands. And the burials, the average density of the burials don't exceed 300 burials per acre. So specifically the land trust goals in this project is all about land conservation, as is our other work, protecting water quality and wildlife habitat, and then really trying to figure out how to model environmentally friendly burial practices. And we think of this as helping to serve the community. You know, we are all born, we are all going to die, and there's a lot of us, and we just think this is an important to make a contribution to the community to find an environmentally sensible way to bury our loved ones. And we've been doing this by partnering with a lot of local businesses throughout this last few years of this process. I want to spend just a couple minutes here on the timeline. And I would just say, even by showing a timeline, and by putting things in a linear fashion like this, it makes it look like it's like a step by step by step linear thing. And it definitely has not been. It's been a very circuitous, winding path. And I don't think that any other land trust trying to come up with a conservation burial ground is not likely to have the same path. So this is just a little bit of our story, but and very briefly. What we saw, the Ramsey Creek Preserve pictures that Allison just shared, was an inspiration to Teresa Kirchner, who is the executive director of the Kennebec Land Trust. And in 2007, she read the Land Trust Alliance authored a paper called Final Stop for Land Trusts and Saving Land. And that featured the Ramsey Creek Preserve, and it really planted a seed for Teresa and thinking about whether this could be something that the Kennebec Land Trust might be able to do. So she was stewing about that and talking to members about it for quite a while. And then it wasn't until around 2016. One of the things that the Land Trust does that I just am a huge supporter of is they're supporting educationally, providing interns with opportunities. And the interns always have a research project in addition to working out on the lands. And the 2016 intern, one of them was Josh Caldwell, which, yes, happened to be my son. So we'd have some really great dinner conversations about green burials and natural burials. So he picked the conservation burial ground as a research project and wrote a paper that is on the website. I'm a little biased, but I think it's a great paper. You can check it out, just kind of generally speaking, what conservation burial is all about. And then that paper was circulated to members and on the website and got more conversations rolling. And then in 2017, we had a couple of lead donors, Paul Kuhnert and Judith Graber, were very generously offered to Teresa that they wanted to financially support the Kennebec Land Trust in pursuing this project. So it kind of gave license to really start thinking seriously about how it might work on the Kennebec Land Trust region's lands. And then in 2018, Dave Roke, who's now a retired soil scientist with the state, he wrote a paper called Guidelines for the Selection and Development of Green Cemeteries in Maine. And there's also a link to that on the website. And it really provided the soils guidelines for what you might want to look for if you want to create a conservation burial ground. And then Kennebec Land Trust took that data and overlaid it on its 21 town area and started looking around for what might be good soils for being able to do a project like this. And then that same year, another intern, Jack Daly, also chose to work on furthering the steps, getting closer and closer to the Land Trust, actualizing a conservation burial ground. And he did a brochure, a member brochure in his summer work. So as the Land Trust overlay the soils maps, it was incredibly fortuitous that one of the three, there was kind of three areas that really highlighted as potentially good soils for a burial ground. And one of them just so happened to be adjacent to the Sturdivant Farm conservation easement. So then the Kennebec Land Trust had a relationship with the Sturdivant family, and one of the parcels was right next to their land, and they were willing to sell their parcel of land adjacent to existing conservation land to the Kennebec Land Trust. So it worked out really, really well. So thanks to the Sturdivant family. And in 2019, the land was purchased, and I'll show a couple maps of that, where that land is, but it was a 90-acre parcel, and the Land Trust had 80 acres of that be the Baldwin Hill Conservation Area, and then a 10-acre parcel be dedicated to the cemetery area. And then within that, a 1.5 acre parcel that was dedicated to the burial space. So once the land was acquired, then the site work could begin and the planning could begin. So they did a lot of site work. There was a road built, a 4-season road built, maybe a 1/4 mile or maybe 1/3 of a mile. up to the top of the hillside. There was a forest management plan completed and a timber harvest. The timber harvest created the view shed from the high spot overlooking. I'll show you some pictures of the view, and also took out a lot of the trees. It's a pine woodland, but took out a lot of the trees to make space for the burial area. Then also there was recruitment for board members, a beginning of working on the operations manual, more work with the town to figure out the planning. And then in 2021, the legal and financial work got wrapped up and the ADA trail was developed. And I'll show you a picture of that. That's a accessible trail for about a quarter of a mile through the cemetery. And then the website was developed, which is, I think, a beautiful website. So I'll show you that as well. Here's just a couple of pictures of the site work, building the road. There is the plan for the burials to happen year round. So, and no matter what time of year you need to bury a loved one, the plan is to be able to do that burial anytime. And then there's a picture of the ADA accessible trail being built in the bottom corner. So here's the geography of the area. This is the green is Kennebec Land Trust conservation parcels. The furthest north in Fayette, silver kind of, what's a cone-shaped triangle. That is the Baldwin Hill Conservation Cemetery adjacent to other conserved lands by the Kennebec Land Trust. I think this map was done at a time when they were doing fundraising for Surrey Hill. So that's another parcel that is now green. And then a close-up of the actual Baldwin Hill Conservation Burial Ground is here. And you can see that it's adjacent to existing conservation lands. And then the Baldwin Hill Conservation Area, the bigger area is shown. That's about a 90-acre parcel. And then of that, the 10-acre Baldwin Hill Burial Ground is shown in purple. One thing that Teresa really asked me to stress in this is the difference between what the Kennebec Land Trust is doing and what some others have chosen to do around the country. And that is that the Land Trust is not trying to take on the role of serving as a funeral home as well. So one of the most important things that you can do if you're considering being buried yourself or having a loved one buried at the Baldwin Hill Cemetery is to plan well in advance with a funeral home. And the funeral home's job will be to provide the grief support services, to plan the memorial service, to coordinate the grave digging, and to transport the deceased. This picture here is Teresa in the kind of green color. And then Jean-Luc Theriault is another staff member at the Land Trust who's been managing the site work. And then in the middle, there is Lynn Roberts Reed, who is of the Knowlton Hewins Roberts Funeral Home and is a friend of Teresa and has been an advisor over the last few years. And then the Kennebec Land Trust role is to manage the burial ground and the trails, to do what we do well as terms of being conservation landowners, and then to sell the interment rights, the plots. And that's available on the website. And then establishing a perpetual care fund as is prudent, but also required. And we're working with a lot of partners in some of the other aspects of what goes on during a burial, and will guide people to those resources as needed. So lastly, I just want to mention a couple more things about the actual operations of how this is going to work. I mentioned that July 1st is when the cemetery will be fully operational, but the Kennebec Land Trust has done what they call a soft open in the month of June. So during the month of June, Land Trust members and those who have been on a waiting list, really eager supporters, and those who have been waiting for the cemetery to open, have started to buy some of the interment rights. So I think in the past few weeks, 60 or so interment rights have been sold. And at the time that they're sold, you don't get to pick the exact spot. The choice of where exactly the body will be buried will happen at the time of the burial. And at that time, those who have purchased a right will be able to look among the choices to pick their spot. And families can plant up to 2 adjacent lots. Native plantings would be allowed of shrubs. Some small stone markers are allowed. And those will be marked in this way. So I know that was really quick, but I was trying to just give you an overview of the story of how the Kennebec Land Trust has gotten to this point, and say thank you very much to those of you, many of you I know who are other presenters, offered your guidance and wisdom to the interns and the staff at the Land Trust, and it's been very appreciated. So I'm happy to answer questions that I think will happen towards the end. And with that, I'll turn it to Joyce next. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Hi, everyone. My name's Joyce Foley. I own Cedar Brook Burial Ground in Leamington, Maine. And we've been in operation since 2007. We were one of, if not the first green cemetery in New England. And I like to give people a little bit of history of how we got started. Peter McHugh and myself were partners in life, and he was retired, decided he needed a project. He read an article about green cemeteries and decided, because we have an old cemetery here called the Joshua Small Cemetery. It dates back to the 1700s and the mid 1800s. And in fact, there are 2 Revolutionary War veterans there. We had an intern doing some research on that. And we've had some of the small family members of today come here looking, doing their genealogical research. And in fact, one young woman and her dad found a missing link in their family tree. So that made me feel very good. Basically, I have to put my glasses on so I can see my notes, folks. We went through the state procedure for establishing a cemetery. And one of the things that was easy, or made it easier and really possible for us to have Cedar Brook, is that Peter owned the land. So unlike the trust and some other situations, we did not have to purchase the land. We own 140 acres here, and 3.5 of it is dedicated to the cemetery. We have a friend down in Annisquam, Mass, when we first started, and she set up a website for us, and then it became word of mouth. We were on 207, the Channel 6 television program. We were on a similar one down in the Boston area, been interviewed a few times, and basically word of mouth, and people who we really started in the forefront of the green movement, if you will. And we're very lucky to get started that early, and it has just grown exponentially, as you can see from all the interest and all the people that are getting involved now. We also had been on Maine Calling with Jennifer Rooks at one point in time. And the basic philosophy or mission statement that we have here at Cedar Brook is to ensure the respectful treatment of the deceased and the family, to preserve the area in its natural state, and to follow the tenets of green burial practices along with the sustainable forestry policy. And Peter had a forestry plan drawn up for the 130 some acres that exclude the house. The cemetery is in a separate trust, so there is no tree removal in that particular site. In fact, when people come to the cemetery, I have a golf cart that I show them around in, and until I point out where the cemetery is, they can't even tell whether it's a cemetery or not. It's that natural. And as has been said before, basically 2 main reasons that I've heard that people come here is for environmental concerns and for the cost. It's obviously much less expensive to be buried in a green cemetery. As been stated, people are buried in a shroud or a simple wooden coffin. And I've gotten people in touch with Chuck, and Chuck has been very kind about showing us some of his display coffins that he has. There's no embalming, as has been said before. And I know some people have asked me about the non-formaldehyde embalming fluids. At this point, I am not saying yes to that. I personally don't know enough about it, and I prefer at this point just to not be involved with that particular project. Here at Cedar Brook, lots are randomly selected. People might like to be near the stone wall. There's a stone wall that goes around a portion, the east portion of the cemetery. They might want to be under a tree. I know people are looking for birch trees right now, and we have a few. We have some lots of pine trees, some beech trees, maple trees. There are even, Peter was involved with the American Chestnut Society. And we have a few of trees that are, some of them seedlings, and some of them have actually grown to be 2 or 3 inches in diameter. That always reminds me of the Kate Braestrap book, Here If You Need Me. And in it, she is talking to her children about, they asked her, what did you do today, Mom? And there are various incidences of what the kinds of experiences she's had. And one of them was that a gentleman had found a piece of a body by a tree, and he called Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and they asked her to go out with them. And it turned out that it was a female body that was found. And she had been deceased for some time, and the tree had grown through her body, using it as nourishment. And Kate said to her children that that is how I want to be buried. I want to be in a green cemetery under a tree, so that my body nourishes that tree. And when you come to visit me, the leaves, the wind blowing through the leaves will be my voice speaking to you. And to me, that epitomizes what a green cemetery is about and what Cedar Brook is about. I used to tear up when I told that story, but I've gotten a little tougher, or a little more in control of myself, if you will, at this point. We do dig the grave sites 4 feet. We do, there's no cement vaults or anything of that nature, has been said before. We have a gentleman who opens and closes our grave sites. I know there are some people who think that takes away from the green element of Cedar Brook. I personally don't agree with that. In the area, there are areas where there are lots of rocks, and it would be literally impossible for someone to dig their own grave. We do allow cremations, burials here, and I do loan a shovel. You do not, if you choose to use the services of Gary, the man who opens the graves for us, you certainly can do that. But if you prefer not to, if you don't have a shovel, I lend you a shovel, because obviously cremated remains don't have to be buried as 4 feet deep, and they must be in a biodegradable container though. And one gentleman said to me that because we're not laid out in a row here, like I said, people might want to be near a particular rock or a tree. He said, you're not using your land very efficiently. And I said to him that when we started this was a philosophy and not a business. And that's really what Cedar Brook is all about. It's a basic philosophy. We've had people, because we were one of the first, if not the first, green cemetery in the New England area. We've had a lot of people from Massachusetts in the beginning, now people from all around New England, and we've had people flown in. I remember one woman her body was flown in from Wisconsin to be buried here. And I found that people who, they may have vacationed in Maine, but in fact, there was a gentleman who just purchased a lot, and he lives down in Florida. And he loves Maine. He loves the memories. He has a child here, and they want Maine to be their final resting place. So I think that's wonderful myself. Once a person has purchased a lot, they receive a deed. I have it notarized at our town hall, and they get the original. I keep a copy for my records. We also, when you purchase a lot, we give you space for a pet if you choose to bury a pet. And when one man looked on our site and he called to see if he could bury his horse. Well, I'm sorry, it might have been a pet horse, but we couldn't do that. But we do have to have Gary open the site. We're in the country here in Leamington. It's a wooded area. We have fox and fisher and excuse me, various animals that could disturb the gravesite. So the animal, if it's buried full body, has to have Gary open that site. And he's very reasonable. He charges an animal fee. I think it's around $150 to $200, depending upon the size of the pet. We had an unfortunate experience with someone who decided to bury their kitty and didn't understand what had to happen. And that's why we now say you simply cannot bury your own pets here. I mentioned Gary. I only sell the lots. Gary Withy is his name. He opens and closes our grave sites. He has the equipment to do it during the winter. I have a metal detector that I bought from an engineering company and have been able to detect the graves under 3 feet of snow. So we know that we can find the grave site no matter where it is during the winter. We mark our graves. You saw the orange mushroom shaped in one of the pictures. Well, I can no longer find those mushroom shaped where you engrave the number on top of it. So we have a square piece of product that we put a 6-inch piece of steel rebar and pound that, and that's how the person's grave is located. There's a gentleman who comes every year and resurveys the area. And there's a map that will show all the numbers that he's already surveyed. And then I have the handwritten in numbers, and he'll be coming, usually comes in the spring. This year he's coming in the fall. If anybody's ever tried to hire a surveyor right now, they know that it's months out before you can get somebody. And he gives me a new map each year. And when a person purchases the grave, I give them a smaller version of it with the approximate location of their gravesite on it. If a friend or a family, we're open 7 days a week for people to visit or whatever, or to be buried for that matter. Gary can open the gravesite on a Sunday if he's requested to do so. I lost my train of thought there, sorry for a minute, but just to go back to Gary for a bit. When he does open a gravesite, we put green boughs in the bottom, and it makes it I call it a softer lowering of the body, whether it be in a shroud or a pine coffin. Gary's fee is $900 for a winter burial and $600 for non-winter months. He is paid the day of the funeral. And these charges unfortunately may change if he should retire or move on or whatever. But at this point, I find that he's probably one of the more reasonable grave openers, at least in this area of the state. As far as the pricing for Cedar Brook is concerned, we have not changed our pricing since we started the cemetery. And it's $800 for a single grave site, $600 for a single site if the person is a veteran. And then it's $700 if a family, husband and wife, friends, life partners, whatever. It's $700 for 2 or more graves that are purchased. And it's $300 for cremated lots. I have a payment plan available for people who need it or want it. As I said, these prices have not increased since 2007 when we started, and we do not intend to increase them. And I don't intend to increase them at all. Similar to what has been shown before, the stones, everyone gets a free stone. I have some that people can select from if they so choose, or they can bring a stone from their garden, or perhaps they have a stone wall, or they might have, one example is unfortunately, a young boy, 10 years old, who passed away from cancer. His family was south of Boston, and they split a stone he used to play on, a rock that that meant a lot to him. So the criteria being it has to be a native type stone, no colored stones, etc. All the stones are flat to the ground. I do not do any individual maintenance of the lots. I make that very clear to people that what I do, and one of the reasons for having not only from an aesthetic point of view, but from a maintenance point of view, is once or twice a year, I have a DR mower, And there are lots of ferns that will grow up and scrubby stuff, I call it, among the trees. And it just neatens it up and it makes it easier to find the grave sites. So once or twice a year, we go over the cemetery where needed with the DR mower. Native plants are allowed, only native plants. Trees, native tree may be planted, that type of thing, with the understanding that it's either going to make it or not, or you're going to come if you feel that it needs watering. I'm not of an age where I have the physical capacity to do that. And I'm being delicate there, guys. But I just can't maintain an entire cemetery on my own. I spoke about the coffins have been, as I said, either pine boxes. I've had a couple of people that have hand woven baskets, and obviously people who've been buried in shrouds. When a person is buried in a shroud, Gary does like to know in advance. He has what I call the straps and slats. And as you saw in previous pictures, he puts slats across the site. If it's a shroud, he uses an extra slat. And then there are straps that go under the body. And once we're a non-denominational cemetery, so once the service is held, whatever it may or may not be, he needs 2 other people to help him, and they lower the body into the ground. The family has the choice of closing the grave with shovels if they want. We've had, usually people will partially close the grave or put a symbolic few shovelfuls on. They may put flowers in the grave if they choose. And then once the service is over and everybody is left, Gary will fill in the grave. Now, if it's a coffin, he usually mounds it because there's going to be coffin deterioration at some point. When that happens, I notify him and he comes back for no charge and fills in whatever indentation there might be. Usually with a shroud, that is not a particular issue at all. He is, to me, one of the nicest people that I have been fortunate enough to have be part of Cedarbrook here. He's a sweetheart of a guy. He looks as tough as nails on the outside, but he has got a heart of gold. He's just a great guy, and he works very well with whether it be just the family or the funeral home. When we first started, because we were one of the first green cemeteries, funeral homes were not sure what they were getting into. But the bottom line is, it's really no different, except you're not going into a vault. The body is being lowered into the ground, and it's being downloaded into the earth, as opposed to being downloaded into cement. And now everybody is comfortable with it. They understand it. They see what's been happening through the several years, and it's not really an issue anymore. I did say that we do allow cremations. And I talked about the surveying. I talked about the fact that we're non-denominational, and all cemeteries are a private matter. We've had some as small as just one person being here. And then we had one recently where there were about 65 to 70 people here. So we have ample parking up at the end of the cemetery to accommodate everybody. So far, we've had no particular problems that I'm aware of anyway. And one of the other issues is that sometimes, because Cedarbrook is on private property, people question the longevity of it. What happens when I pass away, type of thing. And the trust that Peter set up, the road leading up to the cemetery is a deeded right of way. There is a couple who's interested in retiring here. Her family, her mother and father are buried here, and her sister and she and her husband are going to be buried here, and they want to purchase, he's an orthopedic surgeon, and they want to purchase the property when my time comes. They're not ready to purchase, and I'm not ready to pass on. So hopefully we'll have a mutual time frame there. But they understand that the cemetery has to be kept open. They buy into the green concept totally. They also understand that they do not have to sell any more graves if they don't want to, but they have to keep it open and available because people have deeds to this small piece of property that they've purchased. So it's like any other cemetery, whether it's your home town cemetery or it's your church cemetery. Once a cemetery, always a cemetery. And Joshua Small Cemetery that's there is a prime example of a cemetery that's over 300 years old. It's been there.
Grace, I'm going to jump in and I want to make sure we get time for Chuck and Jean, and then we can do more questions and stuff at the end.
It's just about perfect.
Oh, okay. No, I don't want to cut you off, but if you're close to wrapping up for a transition point, then we can.
I would just soon wait for questions, to be very honest with you, because I really don't have a lot more to say. So I'll wait for questions. Okay?
Thank you so much, Grace.
Thanks.
All right, Chuck, over to you. Unmute, Chuck. You're muted.
There it is. Yes. Okay,
I can't see you, Chuck. There you are.
good. I'm a home funeral educator and a woodworker. And I am also the person who writes and maintains a website, lastthings.net, which I will put in the chat, that talks about how to do a home funeral in Maine and has a lot of other information on it also. My job here is to talk to you about coffins. And so I also am going to share a screen and talk about some of them. So, and let's, there. Come on. Okay, this is talking about the basic. This is a bier. In other words, it's a platform that is used to carry a body. It could be as simple as just a piece of plywood with maybe a to put rope handles in. But this one is intended to be sort of something that looks a little more well made to it. And you could be used, and obviously this can be buried too. There's no metal in this bier, and it can also be used in a couple of other ways. In that you can. This is basically what you're looking at there now would be considered like an alternative cremation container to a funeral director. In other words, they would have a wooden base and then a cardboard top on it. And so you can see it can also be used that way. And you could be, it's not only a cremation container, but you could also be buried in one of those. But obviously you would not have, that cardboard is not going to stand up to having earth poured right in on top of it. But the reason I kind of like the cardboard pieces is because that's the way that people really are willing to decorate. And both that bier and that top, an artist friend of mine, I made the bier and then offered to give that to her if she would paint the top and let me display the top for people when they have a chance to see. And you can you can see that it says we all become one, and on the other side it says with everything. And you can also tell that she had herself a really good time while she was doing this. And you see 3 different ways to use the same piece. This is what I call a quick coffin. And I call it that way because I can make one of these in about 4 hours. And this actually turns out to be the kind of coffin I'm most likely to make for people. Last one I made, the guy called me on Sunday afternoon and said, my father just died. How long will it take you to make a coffin for him? And I said, pick it up tomorrow afternoon. And so what I mean is it is a quick coffin. This one, however, is put together with screws. And while you could do it without screws, there is another alternative that would be easier and intended to be used without screws. And that's, whoops, one too far there. Come on. And this is what we call a green coffin. It's a plain pine box. And this is locally grown pine, all grown in the state of Maine. And in the assembly, all the parts are glued together, and then screws are used as clamps for to hold everything in position until the glue dries. And then those screws are replaced with dowels. And you'll see a slide on that just a little bit later. This is a bookcase coffin. And kind of hard to tell that it's a coffin because you can see that the shelves for it are stacked in front, except for one shelf that was installed. The shelves are adjustable up and down, and you can have one of these in your living room and nobody will know it's a coffin. In fact, a friend of mine does have one of those in her living room, and she just loves having new friends over for dinner, because at some point during the evening there'll be a lull in the conversation, and so she kind of livens things up by just mentioning that that's her coffin over in the corner, just to see what happens then. And again, this one is made again with put together, glued and screwed, and then all the screws are replaced with dowels. And this is also a picture of that same bookcase coffin, except you couldn't see where the handles are on this one. The handle is included, but you can see that right at the top of the box that you can see completely, there's a 2-inch wide, 3/4 inch thick piece of wood with rounded edges on it that runs across there. And those are the other side of the bottom part of that same box also has the identical handle on it. So that half of one of the two boxes, that's the one that's always on the bottom. And then the other box is put on top of that. And then you could carry, 2 people could carry it if it's light enough, but you can also easily have 4 people that'll be able to carry that coffin. Then there's always the traditional coffin called the toe pincher coffin. And those are made to fit the person. In other words, in order to make one of those, all I need to know is how tall you are, how wide you are, and how deep you are. With those 3 measurements, and with those 3 measurements, I can make that coffin. But when you're put into that coffin, there's not room for you to move around. You're not going to slide around or anything. And in fact, when you see in the, like the old movies, you always see the cowboy being put into a coffin like that, and you see his arms are crossed across his chest. And that's not anything religious about that. That's to get your elbows out of the way, because otherwise they wouldn't fit into that coffin. That's how closely you come to fitting precisely in that coffin. And then if you're lucky and you happen to know a wood carver by the name of Doug Frady, you can even have him, or you can have anybody else decorate the lid of that coffin. Does beautiful work. And then the last thing is, this is making that bookcase coffin. And you can see in the end of the board, the vertical board that has the notch in it, that notch is where the handle will run across the top of it. But you can see that the 2 dowels that are sticking out of the side of the coffin, one is pointed down and the other is pointed up, because when I take the screws out, instead of the screw is driven in straight. When I take the screw out, I drill a hole for the dowel. And that hole is a 64th of an inch smaller than the dowel, so it'll be a firm fit. And instead of just following the same hole. I drilled the first hole pointed down a little bit, and the second hole pointed up, and then the third hole pointed down, and so forth, going across the side, just as sort of making a dovetail arrangement that will be a mechanical way of holding everything together in case the very unlikely circumstance that the glue might fail. And so those are the green coffins that I make. And I'm available anytime, but if you wanted to make that coffin for yourself, plans are available on the Last Things website. And if you don't have any tools or don't have any confidence that you would be able to make it, you can make an arrangement. You'll come over here to my workshop in Waterville, and I'll walk you through the process of making whichever coffin you're interested in. That's.
And Chuck, you have one that comes in pieces as well. Do you still make those?
Yes, that's a wedged coffin that I didn't choose to show right here because that takes more than twice as long as any of the other coffins. But it stores flat, and it's about 4.5 inches deep, and the size of the top of the coffin is the length and width of it. And it can be assembled in about 3 minutes just using wedges by the sides have tenons on the end that slide through mortises that are in the end pieces, and then the mortise has a slot in it that you can slide that wedge into, which will lock it all together. You can see of what it looks like on the Last Things website. So that's what I have to say, and I can pass it on to who am I passing it
Heading
on
over to Jean now. Thank you so much, Chuck.
And I'm trying to get out of this. There you are.
Thank you, Chuck. And thank you, everyone who has spoken. It's great to be here with all of you. I know we're going a little bit over our time with the speakers, so I'd like to just take 1 minute of my talk and ask people to stand up if you want to, and just stretch for a minute. Just move your body. Can't do it when you're in one of those toe pincher coffins. All right. So I was invited to speak about Jewish traditions. My name is Jean Berman. I'm actually an interfaith chaplain through the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine. Over the course of my life, I've been with many people at bedside, and I care for people who are deceased, both in the traditional Jewish way and, friends or neighbors who, who call and ask for my help. I'm president of a US and Canadian organization that promotes education around Jewish end-of-life traditions called Kavod V'Nechum, which is Hebrew for honor and comfort. And I work for Constellation Hospice. I work with volunteers through the hospice. So that's a little bit about me. And I will just say, I think it was Allison mentioned in your excellent talk that Muslims do a green burial as well. And I've done presentations with Muslim people, and our traditions are in fact very, very similar. And there are other faith traditions who practice green burial. There's one that's not coming to mind. So I'm going to share my screen and let you know a little bit about Jewish practices. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm not sure how to, oh, here we go. Okay. So I'm sorry, I didn't name the Midcoast Conservancy in this. I didn't quite have everything correct about the sponsorship, which now, and now I know. It's Jewish Burial Practices for Evergreen. So in ancient times, burial in caves was common in the Middle East. After a year, the bones, which were all that were left, were moved to an ossuary. And if you want to see some fascinating pictures, Google images of ossuaries. These are places, receptacles for bones, and some of them, not Jewish particularly, but in ancient Europe, the artistry and the architecture that's done using human bones is quite something. I imagine that to be in that a place like that and feel something, who knows what would be something anyway. In the Bible, people are sometimes said to be gathered to their ancestors after they die, which seems to indicate the removal of bones from a temporary burial place to a permanent location. In the biblical story, Joseph asked for his bones to be taken out of Egypt. People had a sense of where they wanted their bones to be. So equality and simplicity are traditional Jewish values. If we go back a couple thousand years ago, funerals and burials were very expensive. Those who could afford to do so or felt that they must do so honored their dead with lavish events. Can you, I mean, it sounds just like today, right? So the poor sometimes left their dead by the side of the road because they could not afford to bury them. One of the Jewish leaders of that time, Rabban Gamliel, so this was about the time that Jesus was alive, taught that all Jews should be simply and economically shrouded and buried, that there should be equality and death. And boy, what a good way to start something. He says, begin with me. Do this with me. So over time, this custom became adopted and a simple linen shroud was used for all. The Hever Kadisha is, so Hever Kadisha is Hebrew for Holy Society of Friends, providing honor and comfort. This is a painting from Prague from the late 1700s, showing members of a Hever Kadisha, the Burial Society, the Holy Society, and I have a few more of the paintings from this series. So the Hever Kadisha went from visiting the sick to preparing and burying the dead to comforting the mourners. The Hever Kadisha, or Holy Society of Friends, provided all these things for the community. And this was an honor to be part of this group. The tradition of the Hever Kadisha still exists in many communities in the US around the world, including Portland, Maine. I'm part of the Hever Kadisha in Portland, Maine, where we have our own funeral home and we prepare bodies there. Prior to that, I was part of the Hever Kadisha in Fort Collins, Colorado. So when Jewish immigrants arrived in a new location, they consecrated a cemetery before building a synagogue, including places in Maine, such as Portland and other places where Jewish immigrants settled. You're going to need, you're going to need a cemetery soon, and you want to be ready to have that for people. This upper photo shows a very small section of an old Jewish cemetery in Eastern Europe. Jews often had to live in a particular section of town, and they were given use of a cemetery, which was only a certain amount of area. So Jews often buried people on top of one another. So many generations. So this particular cemetery, which I visited some years ago, there are 8 levels of graves. So when the cemetery was completely filled, the gravestones were lifted off and more dirt was brought in. And then the old stones were put in along with the new stones of each person that was buried. So eight levels in this particular cemetery. This lower photo of a painting is again from Prague, showing members of the Havre with a bier, and then perhaps making a coffin. Here is a burial shroud, a simple burial shroud, and grave clothes. Jews of today use a set of simple linen garments with no pockets, no sewed hems, and a shroud. And here in the lower right is a prayer shawl that might be wrapped around the deceased. Death is traditionally part of the community life. The Havre that I was a part of in Fort Collins, Colorado, and some other places, people gathered together to sew the grave clothes. In Fort Collins, they have children as young as 4 pulling out the needle, to 90-year-olds, including some people who make their own grave clothes. They do a fabric drive there, asking people for old white sheets and donated fabric. They've made patterns, and they get together and they visit and they sew. However, in most places, people buy simple ready-made grave clothes and shrouds. Traditionally, the outermost garment is worn on Yom Kippur, the annual Day of Atonement, and worn by a man at his wedding. So death is more traditionally more integrated into life. People are buried in a plain wooden box, like those beautiful boxes that Chuck makes. Pine is most often used with wooden pegs. There are no materials used that will not decompose quickly. The deceased is laid in straw inside the basket, inside the casket. There are several holes in the bottom, I think both to allow little creatures to get in and to allow seepage to come back through. A woman I know in Fort Collins makes beautiful coffins from beetle-killed trees. They have purple coming through them. In Israel, people are generally buried without caskets, only in shrouds. Before a person is wrapped in grave clothes and put into the box, there's a ritual washing. Women gently wash, dry, and dress women, and men do likewise for men. If the deceased was LGBTQ or I, some groups will modify who washes them based on the wishes of the deceased. The washing ritual is quite beautiful. It includes prayers and words designed to comfort and reassure the soul as it is in the process of leaving the body and going into the unknown. So in traditional Judaism, there is belief, but one does not have to believe to take part in a beautiful ritual. Poetry honoring the beauty of the body is also recited from the Song of Songs. Honor and comfort are the keys. Jewish traditions are designed to honor the dead and comfort the mourners. We're not going into mourning at all, but there are a number of rituals. There's a way of the community coming around the deceased and the mourners. However, the majority of non-Orthodox Jews or people of Jewish heritage are really not aware of most of these traditions. But the last 70 years, has seen a resurgence in the rituals and the values of the Chevra Kadisha. So for more information, jewish-funerals.org, Kavod V'Nechum, and our educational arm, the Gamliel Institute, provide many resources, education, and training along the Jewish end of life continuum. So now you actually probably know more about Jewish traditions than a lot of Jewish people. But thank you for your interest, and thanks for including me in this panel.
Thank you so much, Jean. Bambi, do you have audio, or do you want me to go ahead and do questions?
Do I have audio? Can you hear me?
You do, yes.
You can't hear me, huh?
Yes,
I do.
yeah.
Okay, good. Then, great. Okay, so I've got some questions. Some are mine and some are from the audience. The first was Chuck. Do you sell any kits? Are you willing to make some kits and sell them?
I think that would be very difficult. I would rather have you just come here and I will have everything ready and we'll put it together for you. But you trying to take home a bunch of semi-identical pieces of wood and remember how to put them all together would, I think, be more than I'm interested in spending all that time trying to write the instructions to do that.
Well, thanks. You're so generous to offer that people can come to your shop. So that sounds like a good option. Joyce, I visited you a couple years ago. I don't know if you remember, I came with several other women. Yeah, hi, you're on mute. And a question that we had after the tour was wondering whether you've seen any or are concerned about damage to the tree roots from the graves.
Right. The answer is we have not killed any trees since 2007. And basically, it's my understanding that if a tree root has to be disturbed, the roots around the remaining circumference of the tree base feed the tree still, and the piece of root that is cut will have ancillary little roots that will grow out of it. So we haven't lost, and we've got, as you know, many.
Oh, good.
So we haven't lost any trees as far as killing them from burying people.
Great. Well, it was a wonderful setting. So yeah. And somebody, I can't remember who, talked about approaching your town to see if they'd be interested in having a green corner. And I wondered what the pitch should be, what are people's objections? Is it just lack of knowledge in terms of being receptive to such an idea?
I can speak about that and maybe others, but Bambi, shall I say a few words?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I'm Allison Rector. I live near Belfast, Maine, and I've worked some with the city of Belfast over the past maybe 8 years. I've approached the city council and met with the cemetery trustees for our city. So I would say, in terms of you have to do your homework ahead of time. So listening to a presentation like this, it's good to know the Maine law around cemeteries. And, in the case of Belfast, I think their reluctance right now is they don't do winter burials. So that was going to be an obstacle for Belfast. And also some of their 9 cemeteries in town are full and others still have space available. So, it's good, get to know your municipality and know what it takes to make a green cemetery. And, they may need extra staffing, they may need extra equipment. Finding the grave, locating where the graves are in winter. Joyce mentioned how they do that with the metal rods, but I respect the cemeterians in my town. It is a calling, and so I think just honoring their knowledge and working with them and offering yourself as a resource. And others may have suggestions, but I also approached my small town of Monroe, and at one point, someone in our county, which is Waldo County, a local business person went to all the cemeteries in our county and did sort of a survey and said, would any of you consider making a section green. And she gathered all that data so that we could approach the few, and my town of Monroe was one where they would consider it. When I approached the town a couple years ago, I actually wanted to buy a site in the town, and our little town, which has 800 or 900 people, their record keeping had fallen behind. So they weren't even certain where they could sell plots at that moment. So you have to work with the abilities of your local town. But I did want to mention during my talk, it's good to visit cemeteries ahead of time, see a few of them, see what you like. And anytime you're buying funeral services, coffin cemetery locations or funeral services of any kind, go ahead of time before there's a crisis. You can save thousands of dollars by talking to 2 or 3 funeral homes, 3 or 4 cemeteries, asking them, hey, do you do green or not? I'll be quiet, but I'll just tell one more story. My family is from Massachusetts. My grandparents are buried, and my mother in the South Shore of Massachusetts in a small town called Cohasset. I really wanted to be buried in some of our family plots that are still available in Cohasset, Massachusetts. But when I called the cemeterian and asked, it's a private cemetery, could I be buried there green? He said, no, I'm sorry, we don't allow that and we're not going to. So you have to have a conversation and work with them. So thank you for asking. Maybe others have had an experience. Chuck, have you?
Anybody else have something to contribute? Allison, you brought up a point that someone had asked about at the outset, and that was if somebody dies in the winter and if the facility doesn't have the mechanism for opening up a grave, what do you suggest? Someone said building a fire to thaw the ground, but that probably isn't going to always work in a deep freeze winter. So what does one do with their body?
I think Chuck is an expert on this. There are lots of things to do, and Joyce. So both of them can speak to this. Great. Chuck, are you unmuted, Chuck? Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, now you're muted again.
Oh, there we are. I was reading it wrong. There's a link on the Last Things website to about a 4-page paper that a guy up in around Presque Isle wrote about different ways of being able to bury a body in winter. For example, Rainbow's End uses just charcoal fire, where they would build a fire over about half the grave and wait a while and then rake it all over to the other half of the grave, add some more charcoal, and then dig down as far as they could right there in that first split. And, just moving back and forth like that. And they're basically variations on that, but there are certainly ways to do it without using major equipment that have to break through frozen ground.
Great.
May I ask Chuck a question?
Sure.
Chuck, how much time does that take to do, to open a grave like that? And do they have situations of rocks like Maine soil is loaded with rocks, at least in this area?
The part of the land that they're using for it, Rainbow's End, isn't very rocky at all. They do run into tree roots because they like to be, a lot of their burial sites are right along the edges of the trees. And so they dig that and they will cut through tree roots, yes.
Great. A 2-part question. This is about conservation cemetery. So Susan, this might be for you. Oh, and so the questions are, you mentioned something about 20 acres. Where's that number come from?
It came from the slide that Teresa gave me that said what the requirements were for conservation burial grounds. Yeah, I think it was, I can find out, but it was definitely conserves or restores a minimum of 20 acres as part to be called a conservation cemetery, or 5 acres if contiguous to other protected lands. So yeah, it does seem like there is a minimum requirement to define yourselves as a conservation cemetery. Maybe, do you know why that is, Chuck?
Chuck, you should unmute.
I think I did, didn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you are.
It comes, the Green Burial Council wrote the basic criteria for the 3 different levels of green cemeteries, and that's included in that.
Is it statutory or is it just guidelines?
It's the Green Burial Council's guidelines.
Okay, okay, great. And then again, maybe Susan or anybody, but for a land trust that's considering going the same route that Kennebec Land Trust went, obviously you were at that for many years, but I guess the question I have is what state regulations and what agencies would get involved? I know Joyce, for instance, as I recall, Joyce, you didn't have soils tests even, but it sounded like that was a major part of Susan's, their quest for finding the right site.
Mhm. I could get back to you with more specifics, but I know that soils was one of the very first things that Kennebec Land Trust looked at. I don't know as a requirement, but just a strong suggestion that you have the right kinds of soils to start with.
Yeah, you don't want to be doing it in wetlands.
No, and then there was certainly
Low
with
line.
working with your municipality to get the 501c13 to become a cemetery. So there's we happen to have a lawyer who is a volunteer on our board who was able to help figure out the document to sell interment rights. So, seeking that expertise from attorney, we also had some really good accountants. So the way that the Kennebec Land Trust is doing it is the cemetery is paying the land trust for the time that the staff are spending preparing the cemetery. So Jean-Luc and Tyler, who are the staff people who have been working on getting the cemetery ready, have been tracking their time and will be paid for by the Kennebec Land Trust. And then the money that's coming in from interment rights sales will help to refund that.
Great.
Yeah, but I could probably suggest you chat with Teresa for more details on your answer to your question, Bambi.
Okay, great. Thanks, Susan. Anna Fiedler, I think, is on the call, and she is the director of lands. I'm not exactly sure of your title, but she is on the call. And I don't know if you have anything to say, Anna, about Midcoast and where we are, if anywhere, in thinking about having a green cemetery on Midcoast land.
Yeah, thanks, Bambi. I think we do not have any designs on doing one. I think if somebody came to us and said, we have a large chunk of land that we'd like to donate for that purpose, it might kick us into considering it. But actually, it's interesting tonight hearing, the options that already exist in Maine is pretty exciting, I would say. And I am a fan of, like, if the resource already exists somewhere else, then, go for it. Use that one. Partly because of what Susan's outlining, that it's a lengthy process. So I would say it's not that we're, it's definitely something we would consider, and it's also sounds like a big project, and there's always more land to conserve in other ways too. But I'm really, really happy that it's something people are considering now, thinking about more of a historic natural burial options.
Great. I have just a little story, and then followed
And Karen's
by
got her hand up too, so we'll be sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Karen,
okay.
go ahead. Go ahead. I didn't see you.
I'll just mention, somebody asked about what in the state, and I know that one of the departments in the state is the water department. And because it's very important to know, for instance, the coastal, you've got to be a certain distance away from the coast, but you also have to obviously. So there was a guy who at one point did was going to come and do a workshop on end of life planning in the Belfast Senior College, and he was coming from the water department. So that's, so probably that might be a department to look at if you were interested in a state government.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So my story is a neighbor of mine who was suffering from a significant illness, was thinking about his end of life and has a wonderful farm near us. And he and his wife had picked out the site where they wanted to be buried. And he actually he created the deed that created a family cemetery so that they could be buried there. And he invited us over to take a look at it and help him figure through the logistics of it. But one of the things that we were concerned about was the proximity to trees. Was between two very large pine trees, and also our soils, it can be pretty shallow. You might not get down 3 or 4 feet. And the next day he had a local backhoe in, and he dug 2 graves and found out that it was totally adequate for what he wanted. So that just added one extra level of comfort for him to know that his wishes could actually be fulfilled. And the question about that is there somebody here who could just talk a little bit about family cemeteries and what that entails? Chuck, you want to go ahead? Chuck, you're on.
Yeah, sure. It's again, right on the Last Things website. It's pretty straightforward. You need municipal approval. I have a lot in the middle of Waterville, and they're not going to let me be buried in my backyard, and I wouldn't want to anyway. But if I were in the rural residential zone, it would be fine. But I also know a woman who was able to have her husband buried in the middle, right outside his foundation building in the middle of Bangor. So you talk to your municipality. They will probably be looking mostly for water sources nearby. State law just says that you can create a family burying ground that cannot be more than 1/4 acre in size. It can be a lot less than that, but it cannot be more than 1/4 acre. But 1/4 acre is like 200 feet by 200 feet, and you can put a lot of bodies in that amount of room. It has to be, the cemetery has to be set aside visually from the rest of the property by a fence, a hedge, a row of rocks, something that just says that this portion of the land is different than the rest of it. Obviously, a fence is not intended to keep anything out, just a marker. And you've seen fences around cemeteries that are just posts every 10 feet with a chain or a wire rope drape between them. And the third thing is that the cemetery needs to be recorded on the property deed. And it doesn't have to be a surveyor's description of the property, but it has to be recorded on the deed. And the effect of recording it on the deed is that family cemetery belongs to the family forever. Even if the rest of the property is sold, that family cemetery still belongs to the family, and whoever does own the property can't keep the family from having reasonable access for visits or maintenance.
Right. Great. That was
Bambi, could I add to that?
Sure.
It's Allison.
Sure.
I just wanted to say I see some friends from the Belfast Eco Village who live in Belfast, and I know their intentional community put a family burial ground, community burial ground in their intentional community. They went through the process that Chuck described. Yeah,
great. And for anybody who's thinking about doing that, I'll just make one minor correction. An acre is 200 by 200. 1/4 acre is only 100 by 100. So keep it smaller. Keep it under 100 by 100. And I think that's it for the questions that I have gathered.
I see one in the chat, Bambi, that I can
okay,
answer.
thank you. Okay, good.
Dolores asks, what if someone who has purchased a plot in the Maine Green Cemetery dies out of the country and is buried there? Can the plot be resold? And I think I can just answer for what Baldwin Hill Cemetery is planning to do. Ask us in 5 or 10 years or 15 or 20 years and we'll have experience. But what we have put in our interment right document is that there can be an assignment of an interment right. So if the purchaser The purchaser, I'm just going to read to you from what it says. The purchaser shall have the right to assign the interment right granted hereunder, but said assignment will only be effective when the seller has been notified in writing of the assignment and the assignment has been recorded in the records of the cemetery. So we encourage people, if they're, to let us know if they're not going to use that, they can assign it. And then also refund and abandonment. If the purchase of the interment right was granted, it's a non-refundable thing for the Baldwin Hills Cemetery. But if there's been notice that someone who bought an interment right has been interred elsewhere, then that will be considered abandoned and can be sold again. So I think that I'm very conscious of this myself personally, because I think people's, plans change. So for example, my parents, I grew up in Connecticut, they were in Connecticut. They're quite elderly now and decided to move to Maine to be close to me. So the plans that they had for where they were thinking they'd be buried changed. So I think that we just hope that people will keep in touch with, if they were to buy something, and don't die for 20, 30, 40 years, plans can change, and hopefully they would just be let people know. So that's our experience.
May I
Great.
add something?
Sure.
Here at Cedar Brook, I have had maybe, I think there have been 2 people, well, no, actually 3. And with our policy here is that, yes, you may transfer the grave to someone else, but you have to let me know so that I can produce a new deed, and it shows in the records that who the new owner would be. And also our personal policy, because we're on private property, is that if someone says to me, which they did recently, they're moving, would I buy back their cemetery? We do not do that, but if there's someone comes and is interested in their site, I would act as, if you will, the broker, that I would sell that new person the site and send the money to the person who originally purchased it. And Peter did reimburse one woman. She had owned her land, owned her site for several years, and she moved to Arizona, and he did reimburse her for half the cost. So that was just a personal policy of his.
Thanks, Joyce. I'm going to wrap it up unless Allie wants to, but I'll thank all of the speakers. This is wonderful. And I wondered whether we were going to fill 2 hours, and we did. We totally filled it. So, so much. We all learned a lot. And as Allie said, you'll all be getting an email from her tomorrow, which will have a link to the website. And I've got a couple other references that I'll add to her email. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank
Thank
all.
you. Take care,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good night.